think Sky is coming. But anyway, Anthony won't be here today, just so you know. But anyway, there were these spots in the back of my neighborhood, like in the back of a couple cul-de-sacs, where they had built bike trails. And these were awesome, epic bike trails. Like people had gone in there with their yard tools and they'd built, you know, dips and hills and they banked curves. It was awesome. But I was not allowed in them as a kid by myself because my mom didn't want me back in the woods by myself because they were older teenagers and stuff and she didn't think it was safe. But I went anyway one day when I wasn't supposed to. And my cousin and my best friend and I went back. And then beyond this piece of woods was like this ridge line that went down. And then, well, there was a marsh because I grew up in Virginia Beach. So there's a lot of like where ocean water mixes in, you have brackish water and you have marshlands and wetlands. So I was out there trying to jump from these logs to logs and I missed and I stepped into the mud, but it wasn't just mud. It was like partly frozen. So it was like icy mud, water and ice. And when I picked my foot up, my shoe stayed in and I watched the water fill in my shoe and I thought, oh no. And then my foot got so cold that I couldn't get back on my bike and go home. And my mother had to come get me. And to this day, we still laugh about it because she looked at my cousin and she told my cousin, you know, she's her brother's daughter. So she got all up in her face and she was like, don't you ever go back in those woods again. You're not allowed. You know, you're better. I'm very disappointed in you. And my cousin was like, okay, I'm sorry. But my best friend was in my room and she practically lived at our house. She's still my best friend. So she was hiding under my dresser, which is, I'm not under my dresser, under my desk, which is the same desk that's in the front room. If you've ever seen it, now it's painted black, but at the time it wasn't. And she was curled up in the space you tuck the chair in. She was curled up like the under there. And my mother's looking at her and I call her Ducky. I've called her Ducky since 6th, 7th grade, but her name's Shannon. So my mom's going, Ducky, Ducky, Ducky. And she's like, no, because she knew she was in trouble. And then she's going, Shannon. And my best friend's like, no, mom, no. All my mom did was pull her out and be like, don't you ever do that again. That's all she said to her because she wasn't her kid like my cousin or me. But she was so terrified she was going to get blasted for being, it was hilarious. We still laugh about it. Scared to come out, hiding under the desk in a little ball crying. Oh my gosh. So we are on to unit 5. And I got to tell you, this is one of my absolute favorites. I love Darwin. And I love natural selection because it provides a mechanism for something we can actually see. We can actually watch evolution take place within populations. Now, macroevolution, where you're talking about like watching a species change over, you know, hundreds of thousands of years, isn't something we can see, but we can see small changes in populations within a species over time, which we didn't in the past have any sort of mechanism to explain. And Darwin provided that. So this is why I really, really love evolution. And I love natural selection. But before we get started, we're going to go back to our last homework assignment, the Resdom family. Do you guys remember the Resdom family? Yeah. Okay, so the Resdom family, this is what we had. You know, Pat had the hitchhiker thumb, this whole guy. All right, so. Yeah, are you going to show them everyone? Yeah, so here we go. Yes. So what I'm going to do is, wait a minute, whoop, before we move on, I am going to show you some Resdom family data. So you can see what we got here. So here's our Resdom family. So we had, this was our assignment, word for word, right? All right, so here's our family. We had Bob and Betty, right? And you guys were to draw Bob and Betty based on their children. And these were their children. I did extra credit. Now, yeah. Did anybody notice that the names for their children are all gender neutral names? Which was interesting when you did your drawings, because some of you assumed they were all male, or some were male and some were female, or they were all female, when all 4 of these names could go either way. And I, yep. Yeah, so I did it on purpose because I was curious to see what you do. So it was interesting. So
I have friends. I was being
respectful. Okay, so
I have some friends named Pat, Taylor, Casey, and Chris.
Yeah.
Casey and Chris are the girls. We're called the C girls. We call
ourselves
the C girls.
Claire, Casey, and Chris.
And then Pat and Tyler. Tyler lives next door, and Pat lives, I think, in Virginia. He's one of my pals.
So let's look at this because we have a lot to cover. So I want to cover it for sure. So the way that you would get your hitchhiker thumb information was one of 2 options. I could go this way or this way. So this is Bob at the top. Bob could have had this combination of alleles or this combination of alleles. And Betty could have had this or this. Basically, one parent had to be homozygous recessive, either Betty or Bob, and the other had to be heterozygous, either Bob or Betty. So either Bob or Betty has a hitchhiker thumb and the other has a straight thumb. Could go either way with that one. For this one, they both had to be heterozygous in order to produce this combination. So they both have detached ears. For this one, they both had to be heterozygous to produce this combination. So they both had to have freckles. And then lastly, they both had to be homozygous recessive in order to produce straight hairlines in all of their children. So here are Bob and Betty, my version of Bob and Betty. So I did Bob and Betty digitally. So this gets fun. So here's my Bob and Betty. That's funny. He does look like Will Smith. So here's my version of Bob and Betty, but I have to show you some honorable mentions.
Yeah. I've seen those. I was yeah.
That was kind of terrifying.
Yeah, no. There.
That was yours, yeah.
Yeah. I think you put the good one at the end, Mom. Actually, they're all girls except Kristen. Yeah, but who drew the stickman ones with like
Wait a minute.
the biggest hands in the world?
Check that out. And that would be Sydney. Pretty awesome, yes? So totally worth sharing with everybody. So anyway, I found those fun and interesting. Yeah. Actually, let me go back and reset them to the beginning. She has animation software because she's Sydney, but I thought they were worth sharing. All right, so here are some misconceptions about evolution that we're gonna share, and we do have a lot to cover today, so we're gonna try and go through. This is one of these videos is a little longer. This one's not too long, but it should give you some idea of some of the problems people have with understanding what evolution means.
Myths and misconceptions about evolution. Let's talk about evolution. You've probably heard that some people consider it controversial, even though most scientists don't. But even if you aren't one of those people, and you think you have a pretty good understanding of evolution, chances are you still believe some things about it that aren't entirely right. Things like, evolution is organisms adapting to their environment. This was an earlier, now discredited theory of evolution. Almost 60 years before Darwin published his book, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed that creatures evolved by developing certain traits over their lifetimes and then passing those on to their offspring. For example, he thought that because giraffes spent their lives stretching to reach leaves on higher branches, their children would be born with longer necks. But we know now that's not how genetic inheritance works. In fact, individual organisms don't evolve at all. Instead, random genetic mutations cause some giraffes to be born with longer necks, and that gives them a better chance to survive than the ones who weren't so lucky. Which brings us to survival of the fittest. This makes it sound like evolution always favors the biggest, strongest, or fastest creatures, which is not really the case. For one thing, evolutionary fitness is just a matter of how well suited they are to their current environment. If all the tall trees suddenly died out and only short grass was left, all those long-necked giraffes would be at a disadvantage. Secondly, survival is not how evolution occurs. Reproduction is. And the world is full of creatures like the male anglerfish, which is so small and ill-suited for survival at birth that it has to quickly find a mate before it dies. But at least we can say that if an organism dies without reproducing, it's evolutionarily useless, right? Wrong. Remember, natural selection happens not at the organism level, but at the genetic level. And the same gene that exists in one organism will also exist in its relatives. So a gene that makes an animal altruistically sacrifice itself to help the survival and future reproduction of its siblings or cousins can become more widespread than one that is solely concerned with self-preservation. Anything that lets more copies of the gene pass on to the next generation will serve its purpose. Except evolutionary purpose. One of the most difficult things to keep in mind about evolution is that when we say things like genes want to make more copies of themselves, or even natural selection, we're actually using metaphors. A gene doesn't want anything, and there's no outside mechanism that selects which genes are best to preserve. All that happens is that random genetic mutations cause the organisms carrying them to behave or develop in different ways. Some of those ways result in
Hey,
copies
I'll
of
make a
genes
space
that
for
exist
Sky over there.
and so forth. Nor is there any predetermined plan progressing toward the ideal form. It's not ideal for the human eye to have a blind spot where the optic nerve exits the retina, but that's how it developed, starting from a simple photoreceptor cell. In retrospect, it would have been much more advantageous for humans to crave nutrients and vitamins rather than just calories. But over the millennia, during which our ancestors evolved, calories were scarce, and there was nothing to anticipate that this would later change so quickly. So, evolution proceeds blindly, step by step by step, creating all of the diversity we see in the natural world.
So keep some of those things in mind when we go through the lesson, okay? So Darwin, I love my man Darwin. So Darwin took this epic journey, right? So let's first start 1809 is when he was born, February 12th. So this year would be his, this year would be his 212th birthday. So he developed the biological theory that it's really his theory wasn't evolution. His theory was natural selection, though he goes specifically to the biological theory of evolution and explains how modern organisms evolved over long periods of time through descent from common ancestors. Now, we're going to talk more about common ancestors, I think, after Thanksgiving. But what you need to concentrate on today is how natural selection works. And that's what our lab's going to show.
I have a question. Are we having class on Thanksgiving week?
Nope, you have no class next week. So in 1831, he began this 5-year voyage. That's a long time to be on a boat. And the boat was the HMS Beagle. And you can see where the Beagle went and see where he hung out around here a lot. This is where your Galapagos Islands are going to be. And this is where he spent an awful lot of time. So like a dog, the Beagle. Now I'll tell you guys real quick, you do have homework this week, but it's going to take you like 5 minutes or maybe 10. So if I were you, I would just do it today. And then after Thanksgiving, maybe Friday or Saturday, you can do your next lesson. And that gives you some time to really have a holiday. So when he was aboard the Beagle, he observed some things. He observed that species vary globally. So he's from Europe, right? But he saw when he went to South America that there were different species there. So a group of similar organisms which can mate and produce fertile offspring. What do we call that? Called what? Can mate and produce fertile offspring. That is a species, okay? This is why you can't say that a donkey is a species, because you remember the donkey is a hybrid of the horse and the mule. And when you put them together, you get, a mule is a hybrid. Mule is a hybrid of a horse and a donkey. And so it's not a species. So donkey is a species, a horse is a species, a mule is not. Mules are not fertile. They cannot reproduce. So because they can't reproduce, that means that they're going to not be a species, although they can mate. Yes.
I told my mom about the donkey and she didn't believe it. And then I actually showed her the one video. She's like,
that's funny.
Why is it making that noise?
So different but similar animals inhabited separate but similar habitats. These are things he's noticing while he's out on his 5-year voyage. So some similar environments have different animals. Like Australia is not that different than some places in Europe, but man, they don't have kangaroos and a bunch of marsupials and stuff like that in Europe. The life forms in Australia are particularly diverse and interesting. I want to go just for the animals. I really do.
I don't really want to go.
So Darwin saw that living things, guys. So Darwin saw that living things in South America were different than those in Europe. He also saw that species varied locally. So even locally, when the habitats were slightly different, the species were slightly different. And this was really what he noticed by his time with the Galapagos Islands. So you got mainland South America, and then you got the Galapagos Islands right off the coast. And the species were different between the mainland and the coast. So that really got him thinking. He saw that the species in the Galapagos Islands were what? Were they the same or different?
Different.
They're going to be different, but they're going to be similar, right? Different, but similar. So similar is not the same. It means kind of like them. Similar, but they did have some critical differences. So he thought that some of these species may have come to the islands from the mainland. So he also noticed that species vary over time, and he did this with fossil evidence. So you see these guys? So the preserved remains of an organism that lived a long time ago, what do we call that?
Fossil.
Fossils, right? So he looked at some fossils and he noticed that extinct animals were similar to some living species. So this is an example. So you've got this guy, the glyptodont, this giant thing here, 3 meters long, 3 meters. Think about how big 3 meters is. That's farther than Lewis to me. That's like Lewis to, I don't know, somewhere around here, versus an armadillo, but they're very similar, right? So then he also noticed, so this is where he gets the idea for evolution, basically. So he noticed that, so what is a trait that helps an organism survive and reproduce? What do we call those traits? It helps an organism survive and reproduce. Yeah. No, almost. So an adaptation, right? An adaptation is going to be a trait that an organism has that helps it survive and reproduce. So Darwin thought that organisms on the island, so here's where he starts putting it together. These organisms on the islands have developed adaptations to help them better survive in their specific environments. And he reasons this was due to the different conditions under which they lived, because the islands were a little different than the mainland, and each of the islands was a little different from the others. So he noticed these differences in these animals, and he thought, well, they must have, and plants too, but he looked at a lot of animals, but he thought these must have developed these adaptations. What he didn't know at the beginning was how they developed the adaptations. So what do you call a gradual change in a species over time? Darcy, you said it a minute ago.
Evolution.
That's evolution, right? So look at these birds' feet, for example. Okay, so these are adaptations. So a sparrow perches, look at the shape of its foot compared to the shape of a duck's foot, or duck paddles. So these are all very similar. They're all fowl, right? They're all birds, but their feet are all different. So they must have somehow developed these adaptations. So yeah.
My dad got attacked by a hooded kiwi in Australia when he was on a golf course, and he was just swinging his golf club.
That sounds terrifying.
Yeah, it was kind of hilarious.
So aside from what he observed on the beagle, there were some other ideas that shaped his thinking. So this is a little historical stuff that wasn't necessarily in your reading, but it's really helpful, okay? So there were these guys, Hutton and Lyell, and they came before Darwin and proposed ideas about an ancient changing Earth. So people were already thinking about this then. So they said Earth is ancient, it's continuously changing, and they helped scientists see that Earth is millions of years old by some of their research. So you had Hutton, all right? This is Hutton, and here's what he said. He proposed that rocks form slowly and that they're changed by forces that twist, lift, fold them. We've seen this happen, right? When we do Earth Science next year, if you're here for Earth Science next year, we're going to talk a lot about how rocks change over time. He also realized that mountains can be worn down by rain, wind, heat, cold, erosion, right? So, newer mountains are spikier, older mountains are rounder. So these are things that he's proposing. And then in order for these events to occur, Earth must be more than a few thousand years old, which was the prevailing idea at the time. So he's like, look, people, there's stuff going on that takes way more time than you've allotted by saying Earth is a few thousand years old. So it must be way older than that.
I read.
And then, hold on, hang on. We'll come back to it in a minute. So the geologic processes that shaped Earth happened very slowly, and they're still happening today. Well, we can see that they're still happening today. Like we can see erosion happen on a small scale. You ever seen erosion in your yard? I've got erosion issues. Most people do to some degree, right? So then you have Lyell. So this is Lyell, okay? He looks like Ebenezer Scrooge to me. I don't know why. But Lyell said that the geological processes we see today must be the same ones that shaped Earth over millions of years. So Hutton says there are processes and they take millions of years. And Lyell says, well, if they happened over millions of years, then they're still happening today. It's the same processes. which seems almost obvious, right? But it's not obvious if nobody's ever said it. It's more obvious to you because you've heard this probably your whole life.
It just sounds
So then he also said there needed to be enough time in Earth's history for these things to change, like a river carving out a canyon. So again, he's agreeing with Hutton, Earth's older than we're saying. And then he agreed with Hutton that Earth, oh, I said that, more than a few thousand years old. So how did their ideas help Darwin? Well, Darwin, while in South America, witnessed an earthquake. Okay, and it was strong enough to lift rocks and a shoreline 3 meters out of the sea, with mussels and other sea life still clinging to it. So he saw this happen, and that made him think, okay. And then he observed fossils of marine animals in the mountains, thousands of feet above sea level. Now, this still happens. People find marine fossils way up high in mountains or out in the prairies where there's no water now, which means, well, there was water here at some point. So this takes millions of years, millions and hundreds of thousands or millions of years, not a couple of thousand. So then he felt that this means that Lyell must be correct with what he was saying, and that earthquakes are one force that over time can build mountains a few feet at a time, which we also know can happen. And so he asked himself, if Earth can change over time, could life change too? So that's a big thought. This is not a thought that people had put them together so much. Like people said, well, life probably changes because we've seen fossils and they're different. But he's like, okay, this takes a long time. So he's getting this concept in his head. So then we have this guy, Lamarck. Now, Lamarck's one of my favorite. Why? Because Lamarck had what we now consider like a ridiculous idea, but it wasn't pointless. So this is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was in the video. We talked about him in that video. So he proposed that the use or disuse of organs caused organisms to gain or lose traits over time. So this is the dude who talked about giraffe necks, all right? So these characteristics can be passed to the next generation. So he says, for example, this water bird has long legs because it had to keep wading into deeper and deeper water. So it stretched its legs longer, and so it could get food. Okay, if this were the case, I would have stretched my arms longer so I could reach things on the shelf at the grocery store. You know, this is not how it works. And my boys would be born with like, you know, ape arms or something. But this is not how it works. Like we know this isn't how it works. If you're somebody whose hand gets chopped off in an accident, your kids aren't born with no hand, right? So he talked about giraffes, how there was this little short neck giraffe and it kept stretching and stretching. And as it stretched, its children were born with longer and longer necks. Okay. Bless this guy. He has become the source of many a meme. Lamarck, Darwin, you got to love his memes. They're so fun. Let me tell you, these giraffes, beautiful giraffes, had short necks to be exact, but they kept jumping to eat those crooked leaves, and all those jumping up and down made their necks longer. Trust me, no one understands evolution better than me. You got this one here. Giraffes are the most heartless creatures because look, this one, you see, this one died because it didn't get food. See, the one at the bottom is dead. See, there's a dead one. Giraffes are the most heartless creatures. And then Lamarck's giraffe theory. Oh, the entire civic community, this is worthless. So people all the time make funny. I love Lamarck memes. But he did help, those ideas did help Darwin because although he was correct, he passed on the idea. So we know traits that are acquired during a lifetime are not passed on. But he was the first one to suggest that species aren't fixed, that species change over time. So that's huge. He also suggested that it's a natural process. So those were big things. And he recognized there was a link between an organism's environment and its body structure. So he was the first one to say these things. And although he had the mechanism totally wrong, and many a meme has been created laughing at his ridiculousness, these things are good points. So he paved the way for folks like Darwin and later biologists, even though people laugh about his stuff today. So then there was this dude, Malthus. Okay, Malthus was concerned about population growth. So this impacted Darwin too. So by 1798, this guy Malthus noticed that people were being born faster than people were dying. So he had this kind of panicked hypothesis that if the population grew unchecked, there would not be enough living space or food for everyone. Oh my gosh, we're all going to die. Okay. So he got very concerned. So the forces that work against human population growth are things like war, famine, disease, right? So he was really concerned. I mean, this was like a panicked hypothesis. Oh my gosh, we're all going to die. In fact, this guy here, this dude here, he went into the Discovery Channel offices. His name was James Lee, and he went in with a gun and threatened people. And he was requesting that the TV network develop a show that mentions Malthusian sciences about how food production leads to overpopulation of the human race. So he was kind of like a nut. That was, and this was relatively recent, right? Because it's Discovery Channel. But he was concerned about, we keep producing so much food, we're going to get overpopulated. And the Discovery Channel needs to cover this. So I'm going to go in with a gun and threaten people.
Fair enough.
So there was when this happened, people joked that Malthus made people crazy, although not really so much. So how did his ideas help Darwin? All right. So he reasoned that he proposed for human populations that what he proposed for human populations would also apply to living things. So think about it. He said, if there's not enough food, resources, shelter, we're going to overpopulate, right? So what's he talking about there? That's really competition. He brings in the idea of competition. So he observed that most organisms produce many more offspring than survive. So this is what we call overproduction. Great example is the sea turtle picture that was in your notes, right? Sea turtles produce tons and tons and tons and tons of eggs. Some of those don't even hatch. Some of them don't make it to the water. Those that make it to the water, a lot of them get eaten or die before they reach sexual maturity and can reproduce. Salmon too. So a lot of animals produce way more offspring than can survive. Plants too. So he wondered which individuals survive and why. So Darwin gets to thinking here, all right, so obviously Malthus is onto something here about overpopulation and resources. So there's some competition. And so why? Who gets to survive? So if all the offspring that were produced did survive, they would overrun the world. So clearly, if all the sea turtle babies that were laid in eggs survived, we'd have so many sea turtles, we wouldn't know what to do with them. So there must be something going on. So he really got thinking. So this is where he starts using some inferences. Remember, that's when you apply knowledge you have to the observations to things you're observing. So he knew about artificial selection. So he studied changes produced by plant and animal breeders. So that is artificial selection. He talked about how some plants bear larger or smaller fruits than others, how some cows give more or less milk than others. And it told him that variation could be passed from parents to offspring and then used to improve crops and livestock. So this is what we talked about last week, right? This is the whole purpose of selective breeding. So he knows about this because he's seen humans artificially select for traits. So in artificial selection, nature provides variations and human selects the ones that they find useful. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's still nature providing the variations. It's still random mutations that cause this cow to produce more milk than the others, but it's the humans that go, okay, I'm going to breed this cow because I want more cows that produce more milk. So he knew that variation occurs in wild species as well as domesticated species, and he realized that natural variation provided the raw material for evolution. Okay, so now he knows that there's competition, stuff is really, really old. Nature provides variations and you can somehow select for them if you are thinking about the process. So artificial selection, here's some examples. He used artificial selection and started breeding fancy pigeons at home. Fancy pigeons, for real. Darwin loved his fancy pigeons. Look at this dude. What the heck is with this dude at the top?
I like that.
So there's some famous pictures of this guy. Where was he? This guy here. This dude. So he bred pigeons. He bred pigeons like this, like for real. He did. So he bred fancy pigeons. See, there he is. Here he is with these pigeons.
I like the one with the bread.
They're cool. And there's all memes about this too. Pigeons, they are damn interesting. Sorry. I love that. He enjoyed himself, man. And this is one of the types that he bred. Like for real, that's legitimate. He bred that. So he's doing the selecting. So then he presented his case for natural selection, which instead of being human-driven selection is literally going to mean that nature is doing the selecting. So he's figured it out now. So he wanted to gather as much evidence as he could to support his ideas before he made it public. In 1858, this other dude named Alfred Wallace had similar thoughts about evolution that were almost identical to Darwin. So what do you do in the academic world when you're trying to succeed? Nah, you get your work out first. So he decided to present his work at a scientific meeting in 1858. along with some of Wallace's essay, like, oh, look, this guy agrees with me, but he got it out first. It's the guy who gets it out first that gets the credit, right?
Exactly.
Watson and Crick, they got their information out ahead of Franklin because she was doing all the calculations and they were just gonna like roll with it. And she spent time on the calculations and they beat her to the punch. So same thing here. Darwin beat Wallace to the punch. So the next year he published his complete work called Origin of the Species. You can still buy this book. It's on Amazon. It's in Barnes and Noble. This book is easy to find. And this is Darwin's original work that explains it's a whole book that explains why natural selection is the mechanism for evolution. And it's pretty impressive. So evolution by natural selection, we have this struggle for existence. So this is where Malthus comes in again, right? Malthus talked about supply and demand and competition. So Darwin reasoned that if more individuals are produced than can survive, they have to compete for food, living space, and other necessities. If Darwin described this as a struggle for existence. So if you have a bunch of baby caterpillars and they're all born around the same time, the ones that are going to be fastest, strongest, best at eating the leaves, can eat the leaves without getting sick, can gain the most nutrients from those leaves on that plant, they're the ones that are going to survive. They're best suited for that environment. Hold on. So they're best suited for that environment. So then he talked about variation and adaptation. Remember, an adaptation is a trait that makes an organism more suited for its environment. So he said that individuals have natural variations among their inheritable traits. So look around the room. We are all varied, right? We are super, super varied. We all have natural variations among our inheritable traits. So some variations are better suited to life in the environment than others. So here's a great example. I'll pick on myself. So I've got mostly Scottish, English, and then Nordic or Scandinavian type genes, okay? The Nordic and Scandinavian people, think about this for a minute. If you know anything about like Norway, Sweden, Swedish in particular, because my great grandmother was Swedish. But if you look at that part of the world, tell me about the sunlight up there as compared to along the equator. How much light do you get? Do you get as much light up there, or do you get? Yeah, it's foggy, but it's also darker for longer. Okay, so what color are my eyes? Super light blue. Why? Because I can absorb more light that way. This also means if I go out in the sun, I need sunglasses. If you descended from people who lived along the equator or lived in places with a lot of sun, like think about South American areas like in Brazil, African, even some like Asian countries that are all along there, what color are those eyes? Dark brown. Why? Because there's a lot of light and I don't want to absorb too much. So this is how it happens. Over time, these changes occur and whoever's best suited survives and passes on their genes. So fast predators capture prey more efficiently. Prey that are faster and better camouflage or protected avoid being caught. And any heritable characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in its environment is called an adaptation. So examples of adaptations: tiger's claws, camouflage colors. These are all things. Plant structures, avoidance behaviors. So here's adaptations. Look at him. He's camouflaged, right? Camels have adaptations that allow them to go a long time without water, which is why they're great in arid climates. And then again, we talked about this guy with his neck, right? How about the polar bear? What color is the polar bear's fur? White, okay. And what color is the polar bear's skin? Do you know? Black, right.
Just
Why?
Like tigers have striped skin.
Yeah, why?
So they can absorb the heat.
Right. It's just like their hairs are actually almost clear, like fiber optics, but because they're so small, they reflect the light around them. So you get this white appearance. But if you were to just take an individual hair and look at it, it's clear like fiber optic, like a thin piece of glass stretched. So the light hits it, shoots right down it to their black skin and warms them. Why do you suppose this cactus is covered in thorns?
Protected. I actually saw one of these. It's like it's wood on the inside. And
Some of them are, yeah, kind of thick. So where do cactuses grow? Cacti, where do they grow? Predominantly. Do they grow in the rainforest, or do they grow, where do they grow? Deserts.
Desert lands.
Okay, so is there a lot of water in the desert? No. So this cactus is full of water that it needs to survive and reproduce. So these thorns are protecting it from having its water taken away. They don't want to eat it because animals are looking for a source of water. So a cactus looks particularly yummy because it's nice and juicy. In this case,
in Arizona, it is so dry.
Oh, yeah.
And, like there's so many cactuses.
Yeah.
And even if you do have water, it is like good water.
Oh, I know. I've been there. Now, how about the peacock there? So that's a peacock. What do you know about, have you ever seen a peahen?
Yes. Those look kind of.
Drab and boring. Now, why is the peahen drab and boring, Drew?
So the males can invest in it.
Oh, that's why the males are fancy. Yeah. Why is the peahen drab and boring? Yeah, camouflage. You ever seen mallard ducks? They're like the most common ducks around here, right? The females are brown and speckly, right? And the males have that green head, right? And those like purpley stripes on their wings. So when we talk about animal behaviors, it's the females that are choosy, and that is true for almost every species on the planet that has male and female members. It's the females that are choosy, and that's because the females are the ones that have to invest the most in reproduction in most cases. In most cases, the males don't have to invest a lot in reproduction. It's a couple minutes of their time and they move on, whereas the females often have to gestate young or sit on nests or do all these things. It's their bodies that end up getting stressed the most, or their time that gets taken up the most. So they're going to pick what they think is the best male. And for peacocks, it's this show of the tail and all this beautiful stuff. Peahens look nothing like that.
There's this peacock lizard that had.
Oh,
kinda
they're
like-
gorgeous.
Yeah.
There's also peacock spider.
Yeah.
So survival of the fittest. Here's this term fittest again. Remember, it doesn't mean fit. Okay, when we say fit in America, like he's very fit. What does that usually mean?
Raw.
Yeah. Now, do you know in the UK when they say fit, what that means? Oh, he's mad fit. It means he's good looking, he's hot, or she's hot. That's their term for good looking or hot or attractive. They say fit. So when Darwin's talking about fit, he's talking about suited to the environment in particular. So he felt that there must be some connection between the animal's environment and how it survives. So the ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment is what Darwin termed as fitness. And it makes sense. It's the best fit. So fitness depends on how well an organism is suited for its environment, and it's a result of an adaptation. Okay, I am not somebody who is well suited to survive in a place with a lot of sunlight, because not only, like I said, are my eyes going to be blinded, but I am super duper pale. I will burn and it will be miserable because I have very little melanin in my skin. But if you have darker skin, you're more suited for sunshine. You can do better in the sunshine and not get quite as fried. You'll still get fried. You still have chances, skin cancer and all those things are still, a real thing.
But in that case, wouldn't you still you'd be a lot warmer?
Well, but I would be, you know me, I can't go 10 minutes in the sun or I'm a lobster. I can't even move, Darcy.
Last winter, I got so pale, my dad wanted to take me to the doctor. I got so pale, and I never tanned.
Is your dad forget that he's Scottish? Because us Scottish people, that's how we look, man. Did he forget? I don't tan, man. Nope. So also, good adaptations allow organisms to survive, and those are passed on to offspring. So if it's a good adaptation, it's going to get passed on. So good fitness means you can reproduce, and low fitness means you have few offspring and you can become extinct. So Darwin thought that this seemed very similar to artificial selection. So again, what we call selective breeding, right? So he referred to survival of the fittest as natural selection. So survival means more than just staying alive. It means reproducing and passing your genes on to the next generation, which is the point of existence of pretty much every organism on the planet. The point is to get your DNA into the next generation. This is why animals will go and do crazy things in order to mate. They'll make themselves into these crazy looking peacocks that don't camouflage at all, right? There's actually a former biology professor of mine wrote a great essay about this particular breed of frog that I think live in South America, this particular species. And like the males call the females by going, wee, wee, and that calls them. But it's also heard by predator birds that can swoop in and grab them. But males have over time found that if they go, wee, chuck, 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 the females hear that and they find it even more attractive. they like the guys that chuck, chuck, chuck. Like they like them a lot. Those guys get more breeding partners. But the chuck, chuck, chuck is really, really audible to predator birds. So to go wee is like, hey, looking for a girlfriend, wee. But to go wee, chuck, chuck, chuck is, I want a girlfriend so bad I'm risking getting eaten right now. And they do it because that's the entire point of life for organisms, is to pass your DNA on. So with natural selection, nature chooses. Artificial selection, man chooses. So your favorable characteristics are inherited over several generations. So here's an example. You've got gray mice and little brown mice. Here's your hungry hawk. Your hawk is not thinking about changing the population of mice from predominantly brown and a little bit gray to predominantly gray and a little bit brown. But it's in his nature to eat. And if he sees those brown mice more easily, he is going to grab them. There will be fewer of them. The adaptation that the gray mice have will get passed to their offspring because they're the ones that don't get it. So another example is here's your peacock. Woo! You know, so you got your male peacock and you got yellow female peacocks, and it's mutated. And you know, this guy, I love this one. Male peacock dies of natural causes, ending passing of traits of offspring. Blood only present for clarification on death. I love that. What? Look at that, upside down, dead blood only present for clarification on death. That's excellent. People are fun. So natural selection. So what's the process by which organisms with variations most suited to their local environment survive and leave offspring? We call this, what do we call it?
Reproducing.
We call it natural selection. They're the ones that survive. It occurs in any situation in which more individuals are born than can survive. And over time, natural selection results in changes in the inherited characteristics of a whole population. So these changes increase a species what to their environment?
Adaptility, I think it's called.
Their fitness. Yeah, Darcy's got it. So evolution happens because of natural selection. So evolution, people have seen, you can see it with your own eyes. You can observe it, especially on a micro level. You can observe it. How does it happen? It's natural selection. And factors that impact it are variation, competition, overproduction. Here's variation in humans. Good gracious, all one species, very different. Here is competition. Now notice here, this competition is between two members of the same species, maybe even three. This guy's looking on. What do you suppose they're competing for? A mate, right? So in this case, the resource is a female ram sheep, right?
It's a ram.
Lazy
Yeah.
person.
And then in this case, are these the same species? So
No.
what are they probably competing for?
Food.
Food, right? And then here's your one little lonely turtle who has to survive amongst his dozens and dozens of siblings. So Darwin argued that living things have been
Really a turtle.
evolving on Earth for millions of years. And today we've got things like genetics and microbiology that we can use to support his theory. So we can actually look at the genetic makeup of organisms and see how closely related they are. So I have a video here on natural selection, and then this is about going to be the end for you guys. But this
episode of Stated Clearly
this one
was
should
only
be-
possible with support from our viewers.
actually,
and from
I will
Brain
bring,
LLC,
is the other
a
group
company
here?
dedicated to developing and
You guys can
delivering
watch
to
it.
patients new treatments for Alzheimer's.
Yeah. We know. Thank you.
Stated Clearly presents What is Natural Selection?
So I'm actually going to let me call the other group in real quick because I think,
It's a
Let
me see, what was after-
It's like a 10-minute video.
yeah, it is. It's longer. You guys can watch this one first. Okay. And then I'll call the other group in to watch the other one together. All right. What?
I ran out of time. So
Here we go.
But of course, it's professional wrestling, and pretty much all of reality television has shown us just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's an accurate depiction of reality.
You seen this?
You probably
Yeah.
recognize the naked guy on the right. That's Homo sapiens.
The naked guy on the right.
The guy who keeps been stalking him is labeled Cro-Magnon, a rough-looking customer who will talk about more. Behind him
Listen.
is Neanderthal. On his heels are Ranopithecus, then Aureopithecus, found delicious. And finally,
That sounds
a
delicious.
tiny monkey-like early dryfish. The idea of this evolving from this may seem like it's right out of the 19th century, but these images actually first appeared in 1955 in a volume published by Time Life Books called Early Man. And in its defense, the book wasn't exactly trying to say that we evolved right from that hairy little homunculus. Instead, the book, written by anthropologist F. Clark Howell, offered a relatively nuanced discussion of human evolution for the time, and even warned against interpreting the illustration literally as a progression from one species directly to the next. The book sold well, and the illustration became extremely popular. And even though the picture originally included 15 different primates in a row and was called The Road to Homo sapiens, the abbreviated version of it became known as the March of Progress. And thus, one of science's most pernicious memes was born. So, what's wrong with this picture? Well, first of all, there are only males in this picture. Humans, like most animals, reproduce sexually, which means we come in two distinct flavors and make our existence possible. Teaching the history of our development with only one sex is like trying to eat sushi with only one chopstick. You're just not gonna get it all. Next, we're not even directly related to some of those guys. Like, as Howell himself pointed out, Oreopithecus was kind of a bit player in the human drama. It lived for a few million years in what's now Southern Europe, but disappeared rather quickly. And the latest research suggests that it probably wasn't even bipedal, as you see here. Then there's Cro-Magnon. While that was kind of a catch-all phrase for primitive humans 50 years ago, the specimen that the term was based on turned out to be a modern Homo sapien. So they're generally no longer considered to even be a thing. We also did not evolve from Neanderthals, as the picture suggests. Modern humans and Neanderthals actually coexisted until about 40,000 years ago. We were contemporaries with a shared common ancestor. But they turned out to be unable to adapt to all the changes in the world around them, including the arrival of us. And that's by far the most important problem with this image. Evolution isn't a linear process. It doesn't turn one species into another. It's really about genetics. Organisms are constantly developing new adaptations, and the ones with the adaptations that make the most fit for their environment end up producing more and spreading their genes all over the place. Scientists call that being evolutionarily successful. And there are plenty of other organisms with whom we share ancestors that are just as successful, like chimps and orangutans, because they continue to exist and evolve like we do. If you had to express it visually, the human story probably would look more like an incredibly complex tree, or maybe more of a fractal, with many stubs and branches, some of which extend to the present time while others taper out. But it definitely would not resemble some kind of primate police lineup. Thank you for watching this episode of SciShow, and a special
Primate
thanks to our
police
some of our
lineup.
subscribers without whom this show would not be possible.
I do love
If you have any
that.
questions or
Primate
comments
police
or
lineup.
ideas for us, you can touch.
All right, let me grab the rest of the crew. And we are gonna do this
This
one.
episode of
We'll do this together, and then we're gonna go over lab stuff together. And then you guys are gonna run and do lab. But
Who won Rico thing last week?
I don't know. I have some things I'm gonna hand back. I think one of you did. I don't remember who. But I'm gonna pass stuff back to y'all while they come in here. All right, if you guys want to come on in, we're gonna watch some, look at some stuff first before we move on. All right. Darcy. Darcy and Claire. Darcy, I think it's up with both of you. They were both good.
Yeah, they both won.
Thompson. We're gonna lab 14. And so we're here.
I don't know what's happening.
It's like a wall.
I think I did it.
No, thank you.
And
Don't know because it's personalitis. True.
all right, y'all come on in. Come on in.
Bob and Billy.
All right. All right, we're gonna first watch a quick video. Candy some things back while I do. And then we're gonna go over some stuff for lab before we begin it. And lab today is outdoors, as you all know. Ethan, this is you. And so once after we watch the video, you may want to take a second to that's you too. You may want to take a second to make sure that you've grabbed Michael a cup. You're gonna need a cup for lab today. Cole. Or I'll pass them out while you're watching. You can do it that way. I don't see Sid or Jack. Here.
Oh, wait, Miss Sandy,
Right.
I'll let you know that Lewis, we decided not to let him go first because he did it on mine again.
Oh,
I
okay.
got everyone but one correct, and he did it on mine.
All right, so as you're watching, don't chit chat so that you don't miss anything important, all right? And I'm gonna pass out cups to everybody because you're gonna need them. You're gonna get with your lab teams when we're about ready to go, and then everybody's gonna break and go outside and Sprite hunt, which is gonna be fun, you'll see. Sprite hunt.
Stated clearly is only possible with support from our viewers and from Brain Tools
All
LLC,
right,
a company dedicated to developing and delivering to patients new treatments for Alzheimer's. Stated clearly presents, what is natural selection? Natural selection is one of several key concepts contained within the theory of evolution. To understand exactly what natural selection is and why it's so important, let's first take a quick look at two other evolutionary concepts, descent with modification and the overarching idea of common descent. Descent with modification is the observable fact that when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different than their parents and slightly different than each other. They descend from their parents with modifications. The differences found in offspring are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent is the idea that all living things on Earth are related. They descended from a common ancestor. Through the gradual process of descent with modification over many, many generations, a single original species is thought to have given rise to all the life we see today. The common descent of all life on Earth is not a directly observable fact. We have no way of going back in time to watch it happen. Instead, common descent is a conclusion based on a massive collection of facts. Facts found independently in the study of fossils, genetics, comparative anatomy, mathematics, biochemistry, and species distribution. Because the evidence for common descent is so overwhelming, the concept has been around since ancient times. In the past, however, it was rejected by many philosophers and scientists for one main reason. You cannot get order and complexity from random chaos alone. The bodies and behaviors of living things are extremely complex and orderly. Descent with modification simply produces random variation. All through history, no one could explain how complex life arose from simple life through random variation until Charles Darwin discovered natural selection. Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contain species of plants and animals unique to those islands. They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they're almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed these similarities could be best explained through common descent. Long ago, a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the islands, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once arriving, laid her eggs.
very good raft.
Random changes caused by descent with modification over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found weren't just randomly different from their mainland cousins, they were specially adapted for island life. The Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands. many of which are home to tortoises. The larger islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises there grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have very little grass, forcing the tortoises to feed on island cactus. The best cactus pads grow on the tops of these plants. Fortunately, tortoises on these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks extra long to reach their food. It's almost as if these island creatures have been perfectly sculpted to survive within their unique environments. How did this sculpting take place? Random descent with modification alone could never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued, thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't actually create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of those new creations are allowed to reproduce and which are not. Darwin proposed that nature itself is also capable of selection. It may not have an intelligent brain like a farmer, but nature is an extremely dangerous place in which to live. There are germs which can kill you, animals that can eat you. You could die of heat exhaustion. You could die of exposure to the cold. When parents produce a variety of offspring, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, decides which of those variations get to live and reproduce and which do not. Over multiple generations, creatures become more and more fit for survival and reproduction within their specific environments. Darwin called this process natural selection. Since Darwin first put forth his idea in the mid-1800s, natural selection has been studied and witnessed numerous times in nature and in the science lab. What started out as a mere idea is now officially an observable fact. Darwin's discovery has greatly expanded our understanding of the natural world. It's led to countless new breakthroughs, and it finally allowed scientists to seriously consider the idea of common descent. So to sum things up, what exactly is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. Through the process of descent with modification, new traits are randomly produced. Nature then carefully decides which of those new traits to keep. Positive changes add up over multiple generations. Negative traits are quickly discarded. Through this simple, ongoing process, nature, even though it does not have a thinking mind, is capable of producing incredibly complex and beautiful creations. I'm John Perry, and that's natural selection stated clearly.
Okay, so I'm gonna end the video.